well, so I posted on Canvas a resource for this lecture that I want you to download, and many of you did. And what I want you to do is open from that resource under Image to Reduce the file called Telescope, the file called Skylab, and the file called Navbar Science. These are all files that need to go into a website, and we were just talking about the fact that you cannot take into a website a PSD file or an NAI file, so you need to compress them. That means turn them into JPEG, PNG, or GIFs. So how do you do that? And how do you do it well? So both software, Photoshop and Illustrator, and InDesign as well, have this option in which you can go in File. In this case is Export. I'll show you in Illustrator what it is. And you can even do a quick export as a PNG, or you can go in Save for Web. This is where I want you to go. So by the way, let's one thing I want to tell you before we do that is make sure you load this file in your system. You know, means what we are acting on is this file out of the 3. So again, I'm going to go in File, Export, and Save for Web. So in the Save for Web option, if you don't have the 4-up, sometimes you start with Original right here. And what it shows you here is that your file is 126K. So it's already pretty small, right? But we need it as small as can be. I'm just zooming in right now. If you hold Option, then you're going to zoom out. So I want to show you that the file, as you can see, is mostly solid color, area of color. So how do you compress the file that is mainly solid area of color? The best way to compress it is a GIF, also said GIF, you can pronounce it either way, or as a PNG. So GIF or GIF stands for graphic interchange format. So remember the word graphic, that G is really key. PNG stands for portable network graphics. Again, the G is key. So every time you have an image that is mostly solid color, and basically is a graphic image, doesn't have a lot of gradients, transition of colors, blurriness, you know, feathery effects. Every time you have an image that doesn't have all that, your best bet is those 2. But I'm going to prove it to you. So if we go under 4-up, that shows you 4 different options for that image. You'll see that the original is up here. We can go down here, and by default is actually right now choosing a JPEG high. So JPEG stands for Joint Photographic Expert Group. So the P of photographic gives you a hint. What is JPEG good for? Photographic image. Every time you have gradation and stuff, JPEG is the king. Now, what if you take a graphic image and you compress it as a JPEG? Now, JPEG likes gradation of color. So it doesn't need it, but really wants to have it there. So what it's going to do is going to start adding it. So right now it's hard to maybe see it on the Zoom. I hope you still do. Notice the original, how there is, even though I'm zoomed to probably 1,000%, I'm looking down here. I'm really zoomed closely to, you know, the point that it does almost make sense, because you obviously will see this graphic at 100% on the website or wherever you put it. But I zoomed in really closely to show you how JPEG, in quote, thinks or wants to compress the image. If it says, you know, I really need some gradation, so I'm going to add these little transition here, these extra pixels that don't exist in here, right? So instead of having a solid dark blue all around the white, it adds a bunch of lighter blue and darker blue to create that transition that it needs. This also is JPEG. It's just a lower quality. This is a 70% quality. This is a 35% quality. What does quality here means? So JPEG is a lossy compression. It means it's a compression in which you lose data. You can see it right here, right? The difference between the original and the JPEG shows you that you lost a lot of those solid blues. So whenever you tell, let's say the image has 200 colors in there, whenever you say you want a compression of JPEG at 50%, means JPEG goes in there and tries to reduce the colors from 200 to 100, right? So if you go 70% or 30%, you know, you can do the proportion. Obviously, it gets worse and worse the more, you know, you compress it, or the lower is the quality. As you can see, a 35 quality is horrendous right here. So JPEG though, let's leave it here, but it's not the ideal compression because as I said, it wants transition and this image doesn't have much transition. Has a little bit of anti-aliasing that if you remember in this image, it tries to go from white to blue with a little bit of, in-betweens, but it sure doesn't want, a lot of, the typical photographic transition of color. So if I go here, oops, sorry, I still had let me actually double click so I get back to 100%. If I go in here and I'm going to use actually the black arrow instead of the magnifying glass, and instead of JPEG here, I'm going to say I want a PNG 8, portable network graphic 8 bits. That means 256 colors, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually zoom in and show you again. If we zoom in, what do we get? I'm holding the space bar to zoom onto that text that we were zoomed in earlier. So you can see now, this is the original up here. This is the JPEG with all these extra kind of pixel to try to create the transition. The PNG is actually pretty good at rendering this one, right? There is not much in terms of extra pixel. How big is it? So the original is 126K. The JPEG goes down to 18K. So the difference is dramatic, right? It went down, 50% smaller, if not less, actually, quite a bit less, in fact, 10 times smaller. Right here, though, is even smaller. The PNG is 4K. Isn't that incredible? It's so amazing. By the way, look at the JPEG at 17 quality. That really shows you what JPEG does to your image if the image is a graphic image. Let's try with the actually GIF, right? Because GIF is pretty much what you would say the competition of the PNG. The GIF doesn't do as good of a job as the PNG. Is a 5.7, and though it does render the text probably equally well. We have 32 colors for both the PNG and the GIF. I could increase the colors. I'll show you in a minute this interface. But what I want you to have in your head is the image of the original, the JPEG butchering the original. In fact, let me butcher a little bit more. Let me go down to like 46%. Now you start seeing the butchering in full glory. And then the PNG and the GIF doing a much, much better job and having very close file size. Now, why do we have two, GIF and PNG, so similar? GIF or GIF was developed and purchased by Adobe. So Adobe said, hey, look, this is a killer compression. I'm going to buy the algorithm from whoever designed it, and I'm going to patent it so it's part of the Adobe products. Online, there are a lot of generous, kind people. They say, hey, that's not fair, right? It means this was a great killer compression and it was free or whatever, it was available, and now you have to have an Adobe product to use it, right? That's not cool. So they came up with a PNG as an alternative that is a slightly different algorithm. So now you have two options, of which the PNG is open source. And I'm a big supporter of open source. So I'm delighted that there is so much generosity offline of people developing software and just, allowing us to use it for free. So that's why PNG and GIFs exist, and they're like similar but different in the sense that in one, you're supposed to have an Adobe product to really do a compression with GIFs. With a PNG, you can do whatever you want. And obviously PNG has been fully adopted and supported by Adobe, because if you remember, when you go in File, Export, one of your options is make a PNG directly. Why didn't I choose that option for this graphic? Since I knew that the PNG was the best option, right? I thought maybe the GIF can be a tiny bit smaller, but generally PNG is slightly smaller than the GIF. You see that the PNG is 4.8, the GIF is 5.7. They're really close, and they're tiny compared to the 126K original. The reason why I did not go straight into do a PNG is because I'm a little bit of a control freak, and I like to play with these settings. So what are these settings? Going back really quick to this side that we haven't talked about, if you go in JPEG, you can choose the quality right here, right? And that's kind of the biggest thing. Now, you can also choose progressive. What progressive does in a nutshell is when you have this JPEG, for example, in this case, we're not doing a JPEG because this is not a good image for JPEG, but let's say this was the perfect image for JPEG. We have another one coming up in a minute. that does need to be compressed as a JPEG. But the bottom line is, let's say you decide to go with JPEG. If you check the progressive button, because you know it's going to go into a website, what it's going to do is whenever the person goes onto that URL, that web page, if the image is progressive, instead of waiting that it downloads fully before displaying it, it starts displaying a lower quality right away. My point is that this image doesn't download all at once. Is slowly, in quotes, slowly is obviously with the bandwidth we have today, nothing is too slow, right? But when I started as a web designer in the 90s, this progressive was really important because it would allow things to start downloading, and right away you got a little preview of that image, and pretty like in a matter of fraction of a second, things would, you know, then go to full beauty, or as soon as the image completely downloaded, then you saw the high quality image. Remember, high quality in web is never too high quality, because you still have to have 72 in resolution, and you still have a compression in the middle, right? What we're doing right now, in a way, it can degrade the image, especially JPEG. Another thing I was telling you is the JPEG is lossy. You tend to lose quality. GIF is not. GIF and PNG are not lossy. Also, JPEG does not support transparency. So for example, if you had an image that has transparency and you want to save it with that transparent background, you definitely cannot do it with JPEG, versus PNG and GIFs support transparency. Also, JPEG does not support animation, so you cannot do an animated GIF, obviously, with a JPEG. You can definitely do it with the GIF compression. So just to let you know the differences. Now, how do these variables here for the JPEG are pretty simple, right? You can basically just hit the quality. You want to optimize, you can choose progressive if you know for sure this image is going to go on a website. And definitely I would always embed the color profile. We will talk in this class about printing and color profile, not this week. This week is more about animation. Anyway, so this is the options for your JPEG that matter. Now also convert to RGB or sRGB. Remember, if you have a CMYK that is the native default for Illustrator, and you want to put this image onto a website, RGB is the default for web graphics, so you definitely want to convert it to sRGB. That is why is checked. You could also change the size down here. I never recommend it. I always tell you, prepare it, go in image size and shrink it in Photoshop, then compress. But let's say you have a second thought, later you realize, oh my God, this is too big. You can hit 50% here and it will, you know, produce a GIF or JPEG or PNG at your, you know, instead of 524 by 82, 41 by 200 and whatever, the 250 would be 500, you know, 262. So it would basically make these half if you go in 50%. Anyway, so this is the JPEG for you. Let's go into PNG and GIFs that are very similar, as you can see, right? Very little changes. If you switch between PNG and GIF, what it changes is the profile. Embed color profile in the PNG goes away in the GIFs. So what matters in this case is, so you have different palettes you can use. First of all, you can use more colors. It will make the file size, for this image it doesn't matter because it has very few colors, as you can see. In fact, what we can do is, let's play with colors. Instead of 32, what if we go with 16? I'm working with the PNG. I don't know if you caught the difference. It had a tiny little shift. Stare at that image. I'm switching back to 32. Did you see that? It has a little bit more definition with the 32, but then I wonder if I go at 100%, does it matter? Probably not. Now, what's the difference though in terms of file size is minimal, right? Between 16 and 32, we have between 4 and 4.8K. So it's probably, I would probably keep the 32. What this means is this image has a little bit more than 16. That's all. So if this image had less than 16, it would not make any difference. But it has a tiny bit more, probably because of the anti-aliasing, right? The transition between the colors. Now here, you have different palettes that you can use. Obviously, you can even turn everything to grayscale, even though it's much better to do it within Photoshop because you have more control, or black and white that is pretty much the same. It's just a different algorithm. But what if I go in perceptual? So the difference sometimes is just a matter of file size. 4.8 with perceptual, and also stare at the image. Let me actually go a little bit closer and hold, make it in between so I can see both all the colors as much as possible. Okay, so perceptual versus adaptive. Oh, not very much difference down here, does it? I don't know if you see any different. I'm generally really squint. I don't see any. And then what if we go in selective? Again, you can see here the color are perceived slightly differently. And restrictive is huge difference though. You see that? Restrictive generally really doesn't do a good job. You can Google what each of these algorithms really do. I don't remember, to be honest. Dither means when you have a little bit of noise around the transitions. So right now I have no dither because it's a graphic image. So I don't want to dither, but so you can add basically this thing called diffusion, and this image doesn't show that much. Increases the file size though to 4.9 instead of 8. Or you can say I want a little bit of noise around thing, and it does add a few pixels around the white, and it makes it quite a bit bigger. For the purpose of this image, it does not help at all. And then again, if you had transparency, you would check this. In this case, we don't have transparency, so I can take it off. Again, you can use the interlace, like interlace and progressive is the same thing. Do you remember in JPEG there was progressive that allows the image to load, and as soon as it starts loading, it shows up on the website. It kind of does the same effect with interlace, and then you can embed the color profile that I always recommend you do, but it's most important when you print. In this case, it's just like an extra piece of information that can actually increase the file size. Look, it went to 5.4, so I'm actually going to take it off because I'm not going to print it. I'm going to see if perceptual is smaller. Yeah, tiny bit smaller. 4.81 versus 4.88. So what are you doing in this interface? You're looking for the smallest possible file size and the highest possible quality. I'm zooming in this image because it's so small, but remember what you will ultimately see is the 100%. So you almost want to look at it more like in this format if the change happens in this format, even though I would have to make this window quite a bit bigger or go under the 2 up and then zoom in a little bit just to see, instead of, zooming into 1,000%. So that's kind of the differences here. I'm going to say cancel, and I'm going to show you the Skylab PSD, because this one is a photograph, right? So if I go and I do the same thing, export, save for web, this time, and I'm going to use the 2. I think the 4 is a little bit too much or overwhelming. So here I have the original. There's 271K. And this one I have the JPEG version, right? Do you see that? So if I switch to this side, the compressed version, I have a JPEG high right now. As you can see, the top is pretty good. It's pretty accurate to the original. Now the problem happens right here. Right here, there's text, and it can be tricky because this really would need to be compressed as a GIF. And that kind of teaches you that sometimes in images like that, you want to cut the 2 images and compress the top as a JPEG, the bottom as a GIF or PNG, and then reunite them into the HTML, right? Create a div, or I don't know if you know any HTML code, but you create a container in which and a table inside so that they stay really nice and tight, in which you have the top cell, the JPEG, and the bottom cell, the graphic format, no matter if it's PNG or GIF. But as you can see, if you're dealing with photograph, it's about no-brainer. You want to try to do JPEG. Now, what if I do this as a GIF? What happens? Or a PNG? You can see the result, right? And this is at 32 colors. Let's go at 16 colors, so it really makes it a lot more visible. It's crazy. Now, also, this is 30K. Let me actually go 32. That is a little bit better. Actually, let me go 64. That might go really pretty close. Great. So you might tell me, hey, look, if I go at 64, I'm closer to the JPEG quality, but the file size is 45K. So what if I switch this to JPEG, and not 70% is even too much. Let's go at 57. We have a little bit smaller file size, 41. So, and the quality, I would have to zoom in a little bit closer and switch between JPEG and PNG. Yeah, PNG has much more You see, if I zoom in closely, now you see the difference. This is the PNG. It's trying, and then at 100%, it probably wouldn't matter humongously for this image, but I want you to see what it does to the image. It goes in, and everywhere where there's transition, it puts a bunch of, pixels that are kind of like solid area of colors, versus here, the JPEG is nice and, blurry, smooth, whatever you call it. Blurry means there is that feathery effect. Is that clear to everyone what the difference between JPEG and GIF or PNG is? So I have a question. I cannot see you guys, so you have to talk though, because I don't know. So if you see this image right now, what do you think this image would ideally compress as? So there will be images that when you look at them, you feel like they could belong to the graphic world, and so maybe PNG and GIF would be good, but they also have a lot of transition, especially in the sky in this case, and then the robe, right, all this down here. So it could also be better as a JPEG. It's really a matter of going into that interface and see what you can do. But before we do dive into that interface, and that's kind of the last part of the image compression lecture, but I want you to tell me, as an educated guess, what do you think is the best compression for this image? Now that you have an education about differences, what JPEG does and what GIF or PNG do, what do you think is going to be the winner? So it means if I compress as a JPEG, what's this, is the quality going to be the highest at the smallest file size, or do I need to compress as a GIF or a PNG to achieve that? Guys, can anybody talk? Just give it a guess.
Maybe PNG, because there's it's only black and white, and so you can put it down to 2 or 4 colors or something.
Thank you so much for not only telling me PNG, but telling me why. So let's try. Let's go with the 4UP this time though. So it's 313K, and as a JPEG at 70 quality, that is pretty high, by the way, 70. I generally stay closer to the 50 or 60 depending, but let's zoom in and see. I'm gonna zoom onto the hat, because the hat, guys, is contrasty against the background, right, in the original. In the JPEG is a little bit less contrasty, and the face also is a little bit less defined, and we can move down to the robe and everything else. Look, at JPEG at 17 quality is horrible, right? Let's go and look at, I think Jake was telling me GIF, right? So let's go and look at the GIF. The GIF at 32 color looks like this. That is fairly close to the original, actually, to be honest. File size is 52. So the JPEG at 70 wins at the moment. Let's try PNG. I'm staying with the 256 colors. So I'm using always the 8, as you can imagine, just for a matter of file size. The PNG does as good of a job, a little better, in fact, of the GIF, but is 62K, is a lot. All right, so let's try to reduce the color and see if we still get a great quality. So if I go at PNG 16 color, am I at 16? No, 32. Wow, we were at 64. Yeah, I don't think we can go at 16. We're going to butcher it big time. Maybe not. So this is the PNG at 16 color, and it's 37K. This is the GIF at 16, that I think is really the lowest we want to go, and it's 36K. So far the GIF seems to be doing best. And the JPEG, if we lower the quality, I think it's going to start falling apart. Let's try to lower it to 50% and see. Yeah, it's starting to fall apart. You guys seen the neck here that gets all pixelated with a bunch of grays when here is nice and solid? Do you guys see that? So if you look at the JPEG, to go down to the 30-something K to kind of compare to these two, the JPEG has to go down to 50. But if it goes down to 50, we start seeing in the hat and in this neck area or shoulder area a ton of garbagey pixels that we don't need. So I would say these two are the best. I kind of like this one a little bit better because this is really rough. But at 100%, it probably won't matter that much, right? It looks like the best is what Jake was saying, that it was a Jake or Jack? Oh, Jake, right? Sorry, I'm a little trying to remember. But here is a 36.9. So you see, this one is almost 37, and this is 37.3. So these two are so darn close. So yeah, I think the PNG or GIF is the way to go. The JPEG, if you zoom closely, even on the robe, I bet is not the best. Like the foot, you guys see the foot, how is a pile of mush? Here and here is still mush, but more defined for sure. I don't know if it comes across with the projector though. Who knows? With the, sorry, zoom. But anyway, so what does it matter for compression? Always, guys, don't ever take the default. You don't ever take like something like quick export as a PNG, because you don't really know what's going to be the file size or anything. Bye, sweetheart. Learn as much as you can, okay, bud? No. So sorry, kids are going to school at 9 o'clock, so they came to say goodbye. But here we are, the PNG quick export. I don't think it's the best option simply because it doesn't tell you how big the file is or how many colors. You don't have control. The good news is if you're doing something very quick and you're not putting it online and you're just sending it to the client and it's a graphic, it's nice to have this option because it is quick. Is no big deal to like get something really fast. Now this export for Aero, I want to point it out because it didn't exist before, and it's really neat because I don't know if you're at all into augmented reality, but this is Aero is an app that allows you to do augmented reality. You can have it on iPhone, iPad. You can export and why does it matter? Because you'll see that we'll create later, right after this lecture, I'm going to show you how to create animation. And it's kind of neat to have an animation you can export to become a piece of an augmented reality interface. So you know augmented reality, what you do is you overlap, for example, your animation or whatever you created in your digital work onto the reality, right? You're basically using the camera on an iPad or iPhone, so you capture the real world and overlay on top of it whatever creative work you have done, and it's sweet to have right at your fingertip a way to export your creative work so it goes straight to the right place when you want to do AR. Any questions on compression? One thing I want to show to you guys is in those file under images to reduce, you have many more, right? You have this one, you have and they're tiny. As I said, the idea here was to put them in a website for the Exploratorium at the time. So that's why they're so small, because you want to scale. What does this teaches you too is if you know that you want this to be small icons onto a website, you definitely don't want to have them huge and just compress the huge image. You kind of want to go in there and say image size and say, hey, this little element is in one spot on the website that is not going to be bigger than 300 by 200 pixel. So you definitely want to make sure you set it up that size, because obviously if it's bigger in pixels, when you go and try to compress it, it's going to generate a bigger file, and the smallest file size for web purposes, the better. So be also aware that before you even go into the compressing part, into turning your PSD or AI into a JPEG or PNG or GIF, you definitely want to scale it to the size that it needs to be. So another thing I want to show you is how do you do the same thing in Illustrator. So let me get Illustrator out. In the meantime, while I launch Illustrator, do you guys have any questions? Doesn't look like. That's good. So be aware whenever you are time. Oh no. What does it tell me? Uh-oh, there we are. Oh, this is it. I was actually doing this. Yay. I was playing with this last time. When you guys were doing that exercise, I think is when just before then, I did it myself. So I make sure that that tutorial is feasible. But you'll always, please always know that before I give you a tutorial, I make sure that I do it myself and I know where are the issues even. So in Illustrator, how do I do a PDF, by the way? I forgot to show you how to do it in Photoshop. I apologize. Because we talked about all these compression. Another way to compress stuff is to create a PDF. A way to do a PDF is, I always forget in Photoshop, you can always, by the way, if you don't remember, you can always do File Save As, or Save as a Copy. And down here under format, you can choose, as you can see, you can choose also this stuff that we had in that interface with the 4 windows, right? But again, if you choose JPEG right away, you don't really know how big is your file size. You have no control over anything. Same for GIFs and et cetera, et cetera. Here, Photoshop PDF. So if you do File Save As and you choose under Format Photoshop PDF, that's how you get a PDF out of Photoshop, okay? And again, embed color profile, so you make sure that, you know, the profile is in it. How do you do that in Illustrator? You go in File, Save As again, or Save as a Copy. And again, save on my computer. And again, instead of Illustrator, you choose PDF. So again, what you want to do is always do a File Save As, and then you can choose whatever format you need to save it as. Lastly, and I never remember what it is, but I think it's under Export. Easy. What we saw in Photoshop earlier, and by the way, this stuff has been moving around across the various, remember I've been using Photoshop and Illustrator since the 90s. So that's why sometimes I say, oh, I forget this version, where does it have it? But it's nicely consistent across the 2 software. It used to not be, but it is now. You can go in Export and you get the same interface, a Save for Web Legacy. You can see this now. The reason why I also wanted to show you this is because all the little checker that you see in the background is actually transparency. That is something that if I went from PNG to JPEG, you'll see that turns to white. That means that even though there's transparency in there, I don't have any color behind that object on my canvas. I don't have a big white square there. I absolutely don't. I don't have a path that is filled with white. But if you try to compress as a JPEG, you're going to end up having to have, you know, basically puts white for you. If you go with a GIF or with a PNG, then you have absolutely no problem with that. Also, remember, in this interface, you can do only up to 2 up, versus in the Photoshop one, you have 4 up. So not that it matters dramatically. What it shows you here is that my file size is 1.8 megabytes. If you go with a PNG, and you can see the quality is pretty much just the same, you're going down to 13K. At the maximum color, 256 color. I could probably reduce the color and make it smaller. My point is, let's try 64. Yeah, 64 is just as good, and it's a 10K now. And if you say, okay, I'm curious about if I do it instead with a GIF, I know we can go at 64 is 10K. If I go with the GIF at 64 is 11K. Do you remember what I told you earlier that generally the PNG is a hair smaller than the GIF, and sure enough. So remember these interface of Save for Web, even if the file doesn't have to go for web, it's just a way to compress in which you truly have control over what's happening to your file in terms of file size, and even all these settings. You can finagle all these settings that you generally couldn't if you just get a File Save As and choose JPEG or GIF in the interface. So I'm going to stop the recording because this part, the compression is completed, and I want to go into animation and create a new video for that. So I'm going to stop it.